Good afternoon, everyone. R. Jerome Harris here from the Disciple Diaries, bringing you another video. This video is about that tree in the garden. And that is the title I saw on a recent video I watched on YouTube, why God placed that tree in the garden. And as I was looking at some of the comments of that video, it just struck me that many people still don't get it. And it's understandable, but there's a blind spot. There are things that they are not considering. Even the individual who put together that video mentioned just that tree. Yet God placed in the middle of the garden two trees, and these were special trees, and they were not literal trees. And I'm going to show you that. And I'm going to also answer why God placed that tree, that is the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, in the middle of the garden. Now, some of the comments that were placed there was, well, God placed that tree there as a test for the man and later on the woman. And that God placed that tree there so that they had a choice, either to disobey him or obey him. None of those are correct. And I'm going to bring the receipts. I'm going to show you. But in order for one to come to an understanding of what the tree of the knowledge of good and bad is, and also the other tree in the middle of the garden, the tree of life, we must understand the nature of trees. So let's go to Genesis chapter 1. This is the creation account, and drop down to verse 11. And we read here, it says, Then God said, Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it according to their various kinds, and it will so. Now, I also want to take you over to Genesis chapter 2, verse 8 and 9. So let's do that. So we're laser focused here. Now, I want you to pay attention to this. Now, the Lord planted a garden in the east, in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. The Lord made all kinds of trees to grow out of the ground. Now, notice this, trees that were pleasing to the eye. So that is a benefit of a tree. Some trees that were good for food. However, a distinction here is being made between those trees, that is, trees that are pleasing to the eye, and those that are good for food, with the two trees placed in the middle of the garden. Because we read here, in the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. These two trees were in the middle of the garden, and these two trees were not literal trees. Think about it. Look at the title of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. Just look at it for a moment. It is the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. So the fruit on that tree was knowledge, not a literal fruit, not a pear, not an apple, or whatever. The same thing for the tree of life. The tree of life also had fruit on it as well. What was that fruit? Life. Now, we all know the story that God forbade the man. The woman had not come on the scene yet because he laid this command upon the man that in the day that he eats the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, he would die. So the man was forbidden to eat the fruit from that tree. Now, what I want to highlight here is what I just read to you back at Genesis chapter 1, verse 11, yeah, and 12. I should mention 12 as well. Let's reread that because I want you to, many people don't get this part. Beginning at verse 12. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And get this part. And God saw that it was good. So the tree of the knowledge of good and bad that God placed in the middle of the garden alongside the tree of life was a good tree. It wasn't a bad tree. Here, God had created all sorts of trees, trees pleasing to the eye and trees that were good for food, and also these two special trees. God saw that it was good. So that tree of the knowledge of good and bad was not a bad tree. So now we have to answer the question, why did God place that tree there? Well, let me ask you this. Why did God place the other trees there? We're given why. If we go back over to Genesis chapter 2, we're told why God placed those other trees there. So therefore, there must be a reason why I placed those two special trees in the garden as well, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. Now, I'm repeating myself because I really need to drive this home. Now the Lord had planted a garden in the east in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. No mention of the woman. She would come much later on. The Lord God made all kinds of trees to grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye, so that's a reason, and trees that were good for food. That's another reason and another purpose for trees. And then again, we learn that in the middle of the garden, there were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So there's a reason why God placed those trees there, like he placed the trees I just mentioned that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. Now, let me tell you why. If one looks at the man Adam, because we're told here that God planted the garden in the east, and that's where he placed the man he had formed. So he had formed. So the man, Adam, was a new creation among everything that God had created in the heavens and on the earth, even the things on the earth before Adam. Adam was an infant compared to the other life forms, the animals, the insects, the birds, aquatic life. He was essentially an infant. Yes, he was a man, but in a spiritual sense and in a knowledgeable sense, he was an infant. He didn't know anything. Now, those two special trees that were placed in the middle of the garden would serve Adam. God did not forbid Adam from eating from the tree of life, the fruit on it. If it's a tree, it had fruit on it, not a literal fruit. The fruit on that tree was life. Adam could fully partake of that tree because as long as he took of the knowledge of life from that tree, his life would be extended from times indefinite, forever. Now, the other tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, like I mentioned earlier, the fruit on that tree was not a literal fruit. The fruit on that tree was knowledge, the knowledge of good and bad. Adam, being an infant, was not ready for that more, how can I put it, solid food on that tree. Now, I use this analogy in a video I produced previously. And this is an analogy of a mother who has a newborn baby, infant. A good mother would not feed her baby solid food, such as steaks and hot dogs and chicken and stuff like that, right? Because she knows that the baby's digestive system would not be able to handle that solid food. In fact, it would prove to be harmful to the baby, choke it, and even kill it. So the tree of the knowledge of good and bad was that is what that was to Adam at that time in his current state as a new creation. He wasn't ready to partake of that more solid knowledge on that tree. In time he would, but only God, his parent, would know when that would be. Just like a literal mother would know when her child would grow to a certain stage where it could feed itself. In the beginning, it might be a little sloppy, but in time, that baby would grow to maturity and will be able to choose its own food and feed itself. Adam was not there yet. So Adam was to rely upon the fruit on the tree of life, life itself. The fruit on that tree of life was like milk to Adam, like milk would be to a literal baby. In time, Adam would grow to spiritual maturity, and only God would be able to determine when he was ready to eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, that is, knowing good and bad for himself. Adam wasn't ready. Does a newborn child, a literal child, infant, know good and bad? No. Its parent or parents would know that. But the child itself would know what's good and bad. It would have to be taught or weaned to a certain level to where it would know for itself what is good and what is bad. It is bad to put your hand on a hot stove. It is bad for you to take a cookie out of the cookie jar when you were told not to. So do you get my point? So the tree of the knowledge of good and bad was not placed in the middle of the garden as a test for the man. It was placed there like the other trees. They would later on serve Adam once he had reached a level of spiritual maturity that only God would be able to determine when he was ready to partake of that more solid food or knowledge. The knowledge on the tree of life was something that Adam could digest. It wouldn't be death dealing, it would be life sustaining. So when God told the man, in the day you eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, you will die. And eventually, Adam died. And of course, his wife died also. They grew old, got sick, and they died just as God said that they would. They died. Adam's punishment was not eternal torments of hellfire. Adam's punishment for disobedience, sin towards his God, towards his creator, was death. The Apostle Paul tells us that as well at Romans chapter 6, verse 23, that the wages of sin, or the wages that sin pays, is death. Yet Christianity has been teaching and still teaches to this very day that the wages of sin is eternal torment in some made up hellfire. You see? So please think about this. And I could go even deeper into this, but I don't want this video to go on and on. And I'm fully aware that there are many of you out there who you don't want to hear this. I know that it is something you never heard before, and it just goes against what Christianity has conditioned and indoctrinated you to believe. It's like this. A lot of you believe that Adam and Eve are white persons. There's nothing I can say to change your mind or get you to think that that would be impossible, because that's what some of you want to believe. There are a lot of you who believe that Jesus is a white man. Adam and Eve are white. Angels are white. None of that is true. If the devil has a tight hold of you, it is very difficult to break free of those things. But what I've just given you here with regards to why God placed that tree of the knowledge of good and bad in the middle of the garden, it's valid. And I also showed you that all the trees that God created were all good, including the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. It was placed there for a reason, for Adam to later on partake of it when God says, okay, you can go into that cookie jar and take a cookie. But until I tell you, don't go into the cookie jar and take that cookie. Do you understand? This is R. Jerome Harris from the Disciple Diaries. Thank you for listening.